The river below didn't rush. It waited. Jack Morrow stood at the edge of the bridge, one boot half an inch from the rusted railing, the other planted like it still believed in balance. The Monongahela River moved slowly beneath him, thick and black, carrying chunks of ice that bumped against the concrete pillars with dull, patient knocks. It was early December in Pittsburgh, the kind of cold that didn't shout, but sank in quietly, straight to the bones. The wind cut through his jacket like it wasn't there. Jack tightened his grip on the railing and leaned forward just enough to feel the pull. Not falling. Not yet. Just enough to imagine how fast it would be. How quiet afterward. He'd learned long ago that the most dangerous thoughts weren't loud. They were calm, reasonable. They sounded like plans. Behind him, a soft shuffle of feet. Dad Jack closed his eyes. Emily's voice was small, thin with sleep and cold. He could hear her shivering, even before she stepped closer, wrapped in the army blanket they'd pulled from a donation bin 3 nights ago. It dragged behind her like a cape that was too heavy for a 10-year-old to carry. Jack didn't turn around. If he did, he knew what he'd see. Her hair sticking out from under the knit hat that was 2 sizes too big. Her cheeks red and chapped. Her eyes already older than they should have been. "We're not stopping here," he said, forcing steadiness into his voice. "Just catching our breath." Emily came up beside him anyway. She always did. She leaned against the railing, careful not to look down, and hugged the blanket tighter around herself. Ranger padded forward, nails clicking softly on the concrete. The dog pressed his body against Jack's legs, solid and warm, his head lifting just enough to watch Jack's face. Ranger's eyes were still sharp, still working like he was on patrol. Jack had trusted those eyes in places where trust got people killed. "Dad," Emily said again, quieter this time. "We still have tomorrow." Right. That did it. Jack's grip slipped. His chest tightened, the familiar pressure blooming under his ribs like a bruise being pressed from the inside. Tomorrow. The word landed heavier than any accusation. He turned. Emily looked up at him, her breath fogging the air between them. She wasn't crying. She rarely did anymore. That scared him more than tears ever could. Ranger sat down, planted himself between them and the open-edged tail thumping once against the concrete. Not a plea. A reminder. Jack crouched in front of Emily, ignoring the protest in his knees. He pulled her close, blanket and all, and rested his forehead against the top of her hat. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough. "We've got tomorrow." Emily nodded like that was enough. Like it always was. Jack stood, turned his back on the river, and started walking. They didn't take the main streets. Jack avoided the well-lit areas, the places where police cruisers slowed just enough to ask questions he didn't have good answers to. Ranger stayed close, weaving ahead and back a silent perimeter. The city around them felt hollow at this hour, all steel and shadow, old brick buildings looming like tired men who'd outlived their purpose. After 20 minutes, they reached the mill. The McAllister Steel Works had been dead for decades, but it still dominated the block, a massive slab of rusted metal and broken windows rising against the gray sky. Jack paused across the street, scanning the fence line. No movement. No lights. Emily looked up at it, her face unreadable. "This is the place you told me about, yeah," Jack said. "It'll keep the wind off." They slipped through a gap in the chain-link fence where someone had cut and rewired it badly. Jack lifted Emily through first, then followed Ranger, squeezing in last. Inside, the smell hit him immediately, old oil-wet, concrete rust, the kind of smell that never really left your clothes. The main floor stretched out in front of them, cavernous and dark. Moonlight filtered through shattered windows, illuminating rows of silent machines, their arms frozen mid-task, like they'd been abandoned in the middle of a thought. Emily's fingers tightened around Jack's sleeve. "It's just a building," Jack said more to himself than to her. "Come on." They moved toward the back, past fallen beams and scattered debris. Jack led them to a small office tucked behind the main floor, the door miraculously still on its hinges. Inside there was a desk, a filing cabinet, and a single grimy window. The roof above it looked intact. Jack exhaled slowly. Dry. Enclosed. "Good enough, home," he said. Emily looked around, then nodded. "Okay." They set their things down. Jack dragged a couple of wooden pallets into the corner and laid their blankets on top, keeping them off the cold floor. Emily unpacked their few possessions with quiet care, her school notebook, a paperback she'd already read twice, and the small tin box that held photos of her mom. Ranger circled the room, sniffing every corner, then lay down with a grunt, positioning himself so he could see the door. Jack pulled out the camping stove and set it on the desk. He heated a can of soup, the metal popping softly as it warmed. They shared it, passing the spoon back and forth, steam rising between them. Outside, the wind rattled the broken windows. Inside, it was still. After they ate, Emily yawned and curled up under the blankets. Jack sat on the pallet beside her until her breathing evened out. Only then did he let himself lean back against the wall. The silence pressed in. He thought about the bridge, about how close he'd been, about how many times he'd told himself he was still in control. Ranger lifted his head and looked at him, ears twitching. "Yeah," Jack whispered. "I know." He reached down and rested a hand on the dog's back, feeling the steady rise and fall. Anchor yourself. That's what they'd taught him. Find something solid. Tomorrow. Jack stared at the ceiling, at the dark stain spreading like a shadow above him, and tried to picture what tomorrow could look like. He had no job, no address. $42 left in his pocket. But he had a daughter who believed him, a dog who watched his back, and a city full of forgotten places where things got left behind. As sleep finally pulled at him, a thought surfaced, quiet, insistent. There had to be something out there, some way forward he hadn't seen yet. Tomorrow he'd start looking, and somewhere across the city in a row of storage units no one cared about anymore. A rusted roll-up door sat locked, waiting. A house has walls. A home has people. Jack whispered the words to himself as he sat cross-legged on the cold concrete floor, watching Emily sleep. She was curled up in a tight ball on the pallet, clutching the thin blanket like it could shut the world out. Ranger lay next to her, one paw resting protectively across her legs, chest rising and falling in time with hers. The steel mill groaned with its old bones. Pipes creaked. The wind slipped through cracks in the walls and howled like it remembered what this place used to be. Jack imagined the ghosts of workers still pushing carts and shouting orders over the clatter of machines, their voices swallowed by decades of silence. He rubbed his hands together for warmth, then pulled out the dented thermos from his pack and sipped what was left of the lukewarm coffee he'd managed to brew before leaving the shelter last week. Bitterness settled on his tongue. It didn't help. The office they'd claimed for the night still had 4 walls and a door that closed. That was more than they'd had in weeks. Jack had chosen it for a reason. It was tucked away from the main floor. It was dry, and the ceiling looked like it hadn't caved in. It even had a window, though it was smeared with grime thick enough to block out most of the gray morning light now leaking in. At first light, he rose slowly, joints stiff from the cold. Ranger perked up but didn't move. Jack grabbed the old broom he'd found in the hallway and began sweeping. Dust billowed up in lazy clouds clinging to his jacket, his boots the air itself. Each push of the broom scraped like sandpaper on his ears, but he kept going. They needed to make this space theirs, at least for now. After about 20 minutes, he heard Emily stir. "Dad," she said groggily. "Yeah," he called, still sweeping. She sat up, hair a tangled mess under the hat she never took off. Her eyes, though sleepy, scanned the room like she was checking to see if they were still safe. Jack smiled at her. "Welcome to our humble palace." Emily squinted. "It's dusty." He nodded. "That's what happens when no one's been here in 30 years. She got up and patted over in her socks, arms still wrapped in the blanket. "You slept sitting up again." "So did Ranger," Jack said, gesturing toward the dog, now stretching and yawning with exaggerated drama. "Yeah, but he's a dog." "You're old." Jack chuckled, coughing once from the dust. "Thanks, kid." They cleaned together for the next hour. Jack showed her how to dampen a rag with melted snow from a bucket and wipe down the walls. Emily took to the task with quiet focus, as if the act of cleaning gave her control over something. Jack watched her for a moment, 10 years old, and already carrying more weight than most adults he knew. Once the room was cleaner, Jack rigged up a tarp he'd scavenged from a construction site weeks ago to act as a partition splitting the room in two. One side for sleeping, one for living. He set the old spool he'd dragged in last night on its side to make a table, placed 2 milk crates beside it for chairs, and stacked their few belongings in neat piles. Emily took out her 3 books and arranged them on the table like they were priceless artifacts. Then she added, the photo tin inside were 6 creased snapshots, her mother smiling wide with wind-blown hair, Jack in uniform squinting against a desert sun. The 3 of them at a park before everything unraveled. Emily placed the photo of her mom upright against a chipped mug, anchoring it in place like it belonged there permanently. "Do you think she'd like this place?" she asked. Jack didn't answer right away. He looked around the broken light fixture, the scratched-up concrete, the hole in the wall he'd covered with a sheet of cardboard. "I think," he said finally, "she'd be proud we made it through another night." Emily nodded solemnly. They ate breakfast, half a granola bar each, and water, and then Jack pulled out a dog-eared notebook and a pencil stub. Time for school. For the next 2 hours, Emily worked through fractions and simple word problems while Jack tried to remember enough from high school to keep ahead of her. He had no real plan beyond this, no curriculum, but every lesson they finished felt like a small piece of normalcy, a way to remind her she was still a kid. After the lesson, Jack gave her a task, organize the living side of the room however she liked. He needed to scout a few blocks for resources, dumpsters, water, maybe old supplies. Rosie, the janitor at the library, had told him last week about a grocery store closing near the East Busway. Sometimes those places left shelves, carts, or crates behind. Before leaving, he knelt next to Emily. "You stay inside. Lock the door behind me. Ranger stays with you, okay?" She gave a firm nod. "I'll make our kitchen look nice." "Good. Make sure the dog doesn't eat all our silverware." They exchanged a grin. Ranger thumped his tail. Jack left through the rear stairwell of the mill and made his way along the frozen sidewalks. He stayed alert. Old habits died hard and mapped the area in his head, safe routes, likely supply spots, places to avoid. It wasn't until an hour later, after rifling through 3 dumpsters and retrieving a couple of dented cans of soup, that he spotted a familiar face near the Salvation Army Drop Center. Rick, another homeless vet he used to see at the shelter downtown. Rick was hunched over sorting clothing donations. Jack approached. Find anything good? Rick looked up, startled, then grinned. Morrow. Damn. You still breathing, trying. They talked for a few minutes. Rick mentioned a guy across town who bought a storage unit dirt cheap and found a box of old baseball cards worth $3,000. Auctions at Riverside, Rick said. Thursday afternoons. They open the unit, you bid blind. Sometimes it's garbage, sometimes it's gold. Jack filed that away. On his way back to the mill, he passed a bus stop with a torn flyer half flapping in the wind, Riverside Storage Public Auction, Thursday, 12 p.m. He stared at it. He had exactly $42 to his name. Enough for a few meals, maybe bus fare. But something twisted in his gut. That quiet pull again. When he returned, Emily had lined up their cans on the makeshift shelf and placed a scrap of cloth over the spool table like a tablecloth. The photo of her mother stood in the center, surrounded by pebbles and bottle caps like offerings. Jack blinked. It's not a house, she said, stepping back proudly. But it's home now, right? That's when he said it. A house has walls. A home has people. She smiled just barely. Then we've got a good one. Jack didn't answer. He was still thinking about the flyer. About Riverside. About what could be inside one of those units. Garbage, most likely. But maybe not. Maybe, just maybe, something was waiting to be found. Something that could change everything. You just spent our food money on trash. Emily's voice cracked across the lot like a whip. Jack stood silent, hands in his coat pockets, watching the roll-up door of Unit 114 creak open inch by inch. The rusted mechanism groaned as the auctioneer's assistant dragged it up with 2 hands and a grunt. A puff of dust exploded into the cold air, and for a moment Jack wished it was smoke. At least then it would mean there'd been fire, maybe warmth. Instead, there was just junk. Unit 114 looked like a forgotten corner of someone's failed life. Cardboard boxes slumped to one side, water-stained and sagging. A ripped recliner with one arm missing sat dead center, its faded green fabric pockmarked with cigarette burns. Off to the right, an upside-down baby stroller rested against what looked like a cracked CRT television. There were old clothes in plastic bags, a broken bookshelf, a dented ice chest, and... was that a fake Christmas tree? Jack swallowed hard. Not even a good one. Emily stood beside him, her shoulders pulled tight, arms folded across her chest, like she was trying to shrink into her own jacket. Her cheeks burned red, not from the cold this time, but from embarrassment, from anger. Jack looked down at her, then at the other bidders slowly walking away. One of them, a guy in a Steelers beanie, shook his head as he passed Jack. Dumb bet, man. That one's a total bust. Jack didn't respond. The auctioneer scribbled something in his clipboard and waved a hand in their direction. All yours, buddy. You've got 48 hours to clear it out. And just like that, Jack was the legal owner of Unit 114. Owner of trash. Emily wasn't done. That was all the money we had. What were you thinking? He tried to explain, but the words came out slow. It felt different. I don't know. Like something was off. Yeah, she snapped. Off as in, you just spent everything on garbage. We could have eaten for a week. Jack closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The wind stung his face. Ranger, quiet up to this point, let out a small huff from his spot behind them. His ears twitched as he sniffed toward the unit, nose raised slightly like something had caught his attention. Emily turned away from the storage door and started walking. Jack called after her, "Wait," but she didn't. Not this time. She kept going, hands shoved in her pockets, boots crunching the gravel with every angry step. Ranger hesitated, then looked at Jack. Jack nodded and the dog trotted after her. Jack stayed. He walked up to the unit and leaned inside. The air smelled of mold, old paper, and something faintly metallic. He ducked under the half-raised door and stepped into the mess. Dust clung to every surface thick enough that his boot prints showed clearly behind him. He nudged the recliner with his foot. It wobbled and tilted forward with a creak. Maybe he'd made a mistake. Hell, it wouldn't be the first one. Jack took a slow lap around the small space weaving between stacks of warped books and broken furniture. He opened one of the bags, old coats mostly moth-eaten, some still with dry cleaning tags attached. A milk crate held VHS tapes without cases. Another had tangled cords and an old phone with a cracked screen. But it was the back left corner that tugged at him. Unlike the rest of the mess, that corner seemed staged. A tall dresser blocked the wall, too bulky to move without effort. Behind it, a few boxes had been carefully stacked, then pinned in place by an upside-down end table, almost like someone wanted them hidden. Jack crouched, pressed his shoulder against the dresser, and gave it a hard push. The legs scraped loudly against the concrete, but it budged. When he pulled the boxes away, he saw it. A wall that didn't match the others. The left side of the unit was standard sheet metal, same as the rest of the place, but this wall, it was made of plywood. Thin, cheap, and stained a different color than everything around it. A false wall. Jack reached out and tapped it. Hollow. He knelt down, found a small gap near the floor, and wedged his fingers in. It resisted for a moment, then gave with a cracking sound. One side of the board came loose, revealing a narrow cavity behind it. Jack used both hands to pull the panel free. It hit the ground with a dusty thud. Behind it, a small hollow space no wider than a closet, lit only by the faint daylight filtering through the open unit. And inside, a locked metal toolbox, large and dented, but still intact. A wax-sealed envelope yellowed with age, and an old wooden box about the size of a shoebox carved with initials CM. Jack's breath caught in his throat. Something about it all felt deliberate, like a time capsule waiting, or a message that had been screaming through silence for years, finally found by accident. He didn't touch anything, not yet. Instead, he sat back on his heels and just stared. The chill of the air inside the unit felt colder now, but not in a bad way. Not the hopeless kind. It felt like clarity. Jack stood, brushed the dust off his knees, and stepped back into the light. Across the lot, he saw Emily sitting on the curb, arms wrapped around her legs, her face tucked down. He walked over slowly. Ranger looked up as he approached, but didn't bark. Emily didn't either. Jack crouched next to her, waited a few beats before speaking. "I think I found something." She didn't answer, not money, not gold bars or anything, but something hidden behind a fake wall. Emily finally looked up at him, eyes narrowed. "Like what I don't know yet. A locked box, a sealed letter, and a carved wood case with initials. CM. She sniffed. Could be trash. Could be, he agreed. But it didn't feel like trash. She studied his face for a long second, then wiped her nose on her sleeve. "You still spent our food money." "Yeah," he said, "and I'm sorry for that." She stood. "If it's just junk, you owe me a whole week of peanut butter sandwiches." He smiled, relief washing over him. "Deal." They walked back toward Unit 114 together, Ranger trotting ahead like he already knew the way. The cold had settled in deeper now, but Jack didn't feel it as much. Something had shifted. Something was waiting behind that toolbox, that letter, that box with the initials. And even if it was just a whisper from the past, he knew this much. It was no ordinary pile of junk. and tomorrow they'd find out why. "Dad, it's a secret room, like in a storybook." Emily's whisper echoed off the cold metal walls of the storage unit as she crouched beside Jack, her breath forming tiny clouds in the dim morning light. Ranger stood at the edge of the unit's doorway, ears perked, nose twitching. The dog hadn't taken his eyes off the hollow space Jack had uncovered behind the false plywood wall. Jack ran his hand along the edge of the opening, brushing away years of dust. The light that filtered in through the cracked unit door was just enough to reveal what they'd found: a hidden cavity barely 2 feet deep, sealed off like someone had built it to be forgotten. But now it had been found accidentally, sure, but not by mistake. Jack reached in carefully and pulled out the first item, a metal toolbox. It was dented military style and rusted along the corners, but still locked shut with a thick latch. It had weight to it, more than tools, Jack thought. He set it down beside Emily. Next came the wax-sealed envelope wedged tightly between the toolbox and the wall. The wax had cracked along the edges with age, but the seal itself remained unbroken. On the front, in looping cursive handwriting, were 4 words: "To whom it may concern." Jack held it up to the light, turning it gently. The paper was thick, high quality, maybe even handmade. Whoever wrote it had wanted it to last. Finally, he reached for the wooden box. It was carved with the initials CM. The letters had been done by hand, careful deep strokes with a knife or engraving tool. The lid was smooth and slightly bowed, like it had been opened and closed many times before. Jack brushed off the dust, then slowly lifted the top. Inside were photographs. Dozens of them, black and white, some curled with age, others pressed flat between scraps of newspaper. Faces stared out. Men in overalls standing in front of factory machines, families gathered in front of steel buildings. A little girl with a ribbon in her hair, holding a lunchbox almost as big as her. At the bottom of the pile was a yellowed envelope marked Charles McAllister. Personal. Jack blinked at the name. "McAllister," he said aloud. Emily leaned in. Like the mill, Jack nodded slowly. Exactly like the mill. He opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single photograph, an older man in a wool coat standing in front of the McAllister Steelworks, hand resting on a sign that read, "McAllister Steel, built on sweat, run with honor, 1974. Scrawled on the back in faded blue ink were the words, "Opening Day." For dignity and safety. Jack turned the photo over again and stared at the face. The man was smiling proud, his jaw square, eyes clear. He looked like someone who believed in what he was building. "This guy," Jack muttered. "This guy's name was on that mill." Emily tilted her head. "You think he's the one who hid all this?" Maybe, Jack said. Or someone close to him. But why hide it? Emily turned her gaze to the sealed letter still resting on the floor. "We should read that." Jack picked it up and hesitated. This was meant to be found. Eventually. With a careful tear, he broke the wax and unfolded the pages inside. The handwriting matched the front, elegant, deliberate. He began to read aloud. "If you're reading this, it means no one ever came for the truth. My name is Lillian McAllister. My brother Charles was the founder of McAllister Steel. He was killed in 1975. The papers called it an accident. It wasn't. He died because he wouldn't back down from a man named Walter Kincaid. Kincaid ran Allegheny Ironworks at the time and was buying up smaller mills. My brother refused. Said he wouldn't compromise on safety standards, wouldn't cut corners. Then one day, a machine malfunction crushed him. But I saw the reports. I saw what was altered. And I've kept everything. Jack stopped reading, his voice suddenly tight. Emily looked up at him. Is this real? Jack read silently for a moment, scanning the rest. The letter went on to detail how Charles had filed complaints with the local labor board, how Kincaid had friends in high places, and how after Charles's death, the reports were buried and the mill absorbed into a holding company. I couldn't prove anything in court, Lillian had written, but I kept the evidence. If someone finds this, if someone believes, it's not too late to bring back the truth. Jack folded the letter and sat back on his heels. Everything inside him buzzed, not adrenaline, but something older. Something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. He looked at Emily. Her face was pale but focused. They covered it up, she said. A long time ago. Yeah, Jack said quietly. They did. Ranger let out a soft whine from the unit's doorway. Jack looked back at the opened cavity in the wall. She wanted someone to know. Not just find it, but do something with it. But why now? Emily asked. Why us? Jack didn't answer right away. He stared at the photos, the sealed box, the evidence. This wasn't just a hidden stash. This was a buried history. He thought about the factory, the one they were sleeping in. That same McAllister Steel building, now empty and cold, sheltering them, because no one had cared enough to save it. Maybe this was how it came full circle. Emily reached over and picked up one of the photos, a young man with grease on his face, smiling beside a massive furnace. What happens next? She asked. Jack looked at her. At the photo. At Ranger. Then at the letter again. We find out if anyone remembers Charles McAllister, he said. And if not, we make sure they do. Emily smiled, then leaned against his shoulder. Okay. But we need lunch first. I'm starving. Jack laughed. Yeah, well, turns out we're a little short on cash. Emily raised an eyebrow. You spent it all on a ghost. He nudged her gently. A ghost with a story. They packed everything carefully into their backpack, the letter, the photos, the sealed wooden box, and locked the storage unit behind them. As they walked away, Jack glanced back one last time. He'd thought this place was full of junk. He'd been wrong. And tomorrow they'd head to the library to find a name, a face, a trail. Because somewhere out there, someone else must have known the truth about what happened in 1975. And Jack was going to make damn sure the world remembered it. If no one cared back then, why should we now? The words came out of Jack's mouth more bitter than he intended. They hung in the stale air of the library, like dust particles suspended in sunlight, quiet, weightless, but impossible to ignore. Emily paused mid-step between two rows of computers, her backpack slung over one shoulder, the sealed wooden box tucked tightly under her arm. She didn't say anything right away, just turned and looked at him with that same quiet, steady expression she always used when she wasn't sure whether to push or wait. Jack sighed. I didn't mean that. Emily didn't flinch. Yes, you did. They were standing in the back wing of the East Pittsburgh Public Library, past the outdated encyclopedias and discarded government pamphlets. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered in lazy protest, casting a dull yellow over the rows of mismatched desks and out-of-date tech. Ranger sat obediently near the back entrance, resting his head on his paws, occasionally glancing toward the front like he was waiting for trouble to walk in. Jack had brought them here after breakfast, or what passed for it. Half a granola bar and the last can of beans they'd heated over the camping stove. They'd wrapped the metal toolbox and the documents in a bundle of cloth and wedged it carefully into the bottom of Emily's bag, then walked 5 blocks to the library, hoping to disappear into the kind of silence that only old buildings and forgotten books could provide. Now they stood at a terminal, the monitor humming, as Jack stared blankly at the search bar. "Just type it," Emily said gently. Jack looked at her, then down at the old keyboard. His fingers hovered. Charles McAllister. Pittsburgh, 1975. Obituary. He hit enter. It took the database a moment to churn through the records. Then one match. Jack clicked the link. A scanned image of a local paper loaded slowly, grainy, tilted at an angle, as though someone had shoved the page into a copier without checking if it was straight. Industrial tragedy at McAllister Steel founder crushed in mechanical failure. July 2, 1975. Beneath the headline was a black and white photo, blurry and overexposed, of the steel mill. The article described the death of Charles McAllister, aged 54, in a machinery malfunction during routine maintenance. Words like unforeseen, accidental, and tragic floated in bold type. Jack skimmed for anything useful. There were no quotes from investigators, no details about the equipment, just a brief mention of pending OSHA review and a single line at the end. He is survived by his sister Lillian McAllister and one daughter, Margot Hensley. Jack's eyes stopped. "Margot," he whispered. Emily leaned in. "His daughter, yeah. Married name, looks like." He copied the full name into a notepad file and opened a new search. Let's see if she's still local. 10 minutes later, they had it: Margot Hensley. English teacher, Shenley High School, a 15-minute bus ride from the storage facility. Jack leaned back, staring at the screen. "She's still here." Emily smiled. "Then maybe she should know what we found." Jack didn't smile back. He stared at the flickering cursor like it was daring him to make a move. Emily tilted her head. "You think she won't care? I don't know what I think," Jack muttered. "We barely know what we're holding. Old letters, a toolbox we haven't even opened yet, and some claims from a woman who's been dead for what, decades? But it matters to her, or she wouldn't have hidden it like that." Jack turned toward her, frustration bubbling up. "I know that. But think about it, Em. If nobody believed her, then what makes you think they'll care now?" Emily didn't blink. "Because now we're here." That stopped him cold. Before Jack could reply, a soft voice came from behind the next row of shelves. "You folks need help with anything." They turned. A middle-aged woman in a janitor's uniform stood there holding a mop, eyes kind but cautious. Her name tag read Rosie. Her hair was tied back in a red bandana, and her gloves were dusted with cleaning powder. Jack cleared his throat. "Just using the archives. Hope that's okay." Rosie nodded. "Course it is. Not many folks use that part anymore. Kinda nice seeing someone dig into history." Emily stepped forward. "Do you know anything about McAllister Steel?" Rosie raised an eyebrow. "Sure do. My uncle worked there till it shut down. Whole neighborhood changed after it closed." "Why?" Jack hesitated. "Then we found something. In storage. Belonged to Charles McAllister." Rosie's eyes sharpened. "That man died in an accident." Jack shook his head. "We don't think it was an accident. We have a letter from his sister. She says it was covered up." Rosie didn't look shocked. Instead, she let out a slow exhale. "Wouldn't surprise me. A lot of things got swept under the rug back then, especially when it came to rich men and dirty business." Emily opened her bag and pulled out the photograph, the one of Charles standing proudly in front of the factory sign. Rosie studied it for a long time. "That's him. Younger than I remember from pictures. But yeah, That's Charles. We're trying to contact his daughter, Jack said. Margot Hensley. We think she deserves to know. Rosie nodded, thoughtful. If you want, I got a cousin works in the school district office. She might help you get a message to her. Discreetly. That would mean a lot, Jack said. Rosie gave a small smile. Leave me the info. You two look like you got enough going on. She glanced at their bags. Jack realized she'd noticed how few belongings they had, how tired they both looked, but she didn't mention it. They left 20 minutes later armed with a printed address and a borrowed library envelope. Emily insisted on handwriting the note herself. It was short and careful, Ms. Hensley. My name is Jack Morrow. My daughter and I found something that belonged to your father. We believe it was meant for you or for someone who could carry the truth forward. Please meet us at Riverfront Park near the old pedestrian bridge tomorrow at 10 a.m. We won't waste your time. Jack Morrow. Emily sealed it and wrote the address in her neatest cursive. Jack dropped it in the mailbox on the corner. As they walked back toward the mill, Emily asked, "What if she doesn't come?" Jack shrugged. "Then we keep going. Someone will listen." And though he didn't say it, he knew they were past the point of turning back. Whatever had happened in 1975, it hadn't ended there. Now, with Margot's name in hand and Rosie's help on the line, the next step was simple. Wait and hope the past was ready to speak. The park was quiet except for the river. Jack stood near the foot of the old pedestrian bridge, the one that arched over the Monongahela like a backbone of rusted steel. Below the water moved slow and gray. Beside him, Ranger sat, alert eyes trained on the walking path. Emily paced behind them, glancing toward the playground every 30 seconds, like she expected something to leap out from the swings. 10 a.m. came and went. 10:05. 10:10. Jack checked his watch again, even though it hadn't changed anything the last 3 times he looked. I told you, Emily mumbled. She's not coming. Jack didn't answer. He wanted to believe otherwise, but he also knew what it felt like to throw a message into the world and never hear it echo back. Most of his life lately had felt like that. Then, at 10:13, a silver sedan pulled into the gravel lot. The woman who stepped out wasn't what Jack expected. She was tall, in her early 50s maybe, with short-cropped salt and pepper hair and sharp, deliberate movements. She wore jeans, a green scarf, and a dark wool coat buttoned up to her neck. She didn't carry a purse, just a manila envelope under one arm. Margot Hensley. Jack stood a little straighter as she walked toward them. She scanned the area like she was still deciding whether this was a mistake. You Jack Morrow? She asked. Yes, ma'am. She looked at Emily. And this is your daughter. Emily nodded, hugging her jacket tighter. Margot stopped a few feet away, studying them, with eyes that looked like they'd been trained to read students' liars and intentions. I got your letter, she said. Thank you for coming, Jack replied. Margot held up the envelope. You said you found something that belonged to my father. I wasn't aware he had anything left. Jack gestured to the picnic table under the bridge. Can we sit? Margot hesitated, then followed. Ranger stayed close to Emily, his body tense but calm. They sat. Jack unzipped his backpack and carefully pulled out the wooden box. Margot's eyes narrowed when she saw the initials carved on top, CM. He opened it and laid the photographs out one by one, Charles in front of the steel mill workers, posing beside machines, a group photo with the words "Opening Day" scribbled in fading ink on the back. Margot didn't speak. Then Jack unfolded Lillian's letter, the original, with its cracked wax seal, and handed it to her. She took it slowly. Her fingers trembled just a little. As she read, Jack watched her closely. Her face stayed mostly composed, but her throat worked as she swallowed hard. Once. Twice. When she finally looked up, her voice was rough. "Where did you find this?" "In a storage unit," Jack said. "Bought it at an auction. Someone must have tucked this all away after your father died." Margot blinked, then looked out over the river. "I was 10, she said, when he died. They told me it was an accident, some mechanical issue at the plant. My mother didn't even argue. She didn't want to. She just folded. We left the house, moved to her sister's in Ohio. We never talked about it again." She glanced down at the letter. "I never saw this. I didn't even know Aunt Lillian kept anything." "She kept everything," Emily said softly. Margot's eyes moved to her, surprised by the voice. She hid the box, the photos, the letter. There was even a sealed toolbox we haven't opened yet. Margot sat back. "A toolbox." Jack nodded. Military style. Heavy. Locked tight. She shook her head slowly, as if trying to make room in her memory. "My father was obsessed with safety reports. He kept copies of everything. He used to come home furious some nights, said the other mills were cutting corners, putting men in danger." "Kincaid," Jack said. Margot's eyes snapped to his. "You know that name," Jack explained the contents of the letter. What Lillian had claimed about Walter Kincaid, Allegheny Iron Works. The threats, the refusal to sell out. Margot went still. Then she whispered, "He died a senator." "What Kincaid?" she said. "After the merger, he moved into politics. State Senate. Even ran for governor once. He was untouchable." Jack clenched his jaw. Margot stared at the river again. "If this letter's true, if he covered up a murder, we don't know yet," Jack cut in. "We only know what she wrote. But we want to find out." Margot tapped the table once with her fingers. "Why you? What? Why are you doing this? You didn't know him. You didn't know me. Why go through all this trouble?" Jack looked at Emily. She nodded, then said, "Because the truth got buried. And it doesn't want to stay buried." Jack added, "We're just two people who found a box. But maybe that's what it needed. Someone with nothing to lose." Margot was quiet for a long time. Then, without a word, she reached into her envelope and pulled out a single photo. She laid it on the table. It was of her father Charles, in the same wool coat, holding a clipboard, standing beside a man with slicked back hair and a forced smile. "That's Kincaid," she said. "Taken the week before my dad died." The tension around them grew sharp, like the air itself had leaned in to listen. Jack took the photo. "We'll get the toolbox open. There might be more inside." Margot stood. "I have friends. People in journalism. If we're going to make noise, we'll need them. But only if there's real evidence." Jack nodded. "There might be." Margot looked down at Emily again, something softer flickering in her eyes. "You're brave, you know that." Emily smiled. "So are you. You came." Margot let out a breath. "I did." She pulled a business card from her coat and handed it to Jack. "Call me when you open that box. If it holds what I think it does, this story isn't over." Then she turned and walked back to her car, her steps sure, her shoulders straighter than when she'd arrived. Jack and Emily stood in silence as the engine started and the sedan pulled away. Emily looked up at him. "You think it's really murder?" Jack watched the spot where the car had been. "If it is someone paid to make sure no one ever knew." Emily was quiet for a beat. "So, what now?" Jack glanced down at the metal toolbox in his bag. Now he said we break a lock and open the past. Jack didn't hesitate anymore. The moment they stepped back into the steel mill, he set the backpack down on the makeshift table and pulled out the old military-style toolbox. The weight of it hit the surface with a hollow thunk echoing slightly through the cold, empty room. Emily hovered nearby, silent. Ranger settled near the door, watching them both. Jack ran his hand across the surface of the box. Rough, scratched metal corners rusted the latch still intact. It had no key, no combination, just a thick steel loop secured with a rusted padlock. He pulled out the bolt cutters. "You really gonna do it right here?" Emily asked. Jack glanced at her, eyebrows raised. "You got a better spot." She didn't. Neither did he. He took the bolt cutters in both hands and clamped them over the padlock's neck. The metal groaned as he squeezed. The first attempt didn't work. He repositioned, gritted his teeth. Second try, snap. The lock fell to the ground with a sharp clink, rolling a few inches before coming to a stop. Jack paused. For a second, he didn't open the lid. He just stared at it. Because once it was open, there was no going back. Once you pulled the past into the light, it stopped being mystery and started being truth. And truth could be dangerous. Emily whispered, "What if it's nothing?" Jack didn't answer. He flipped the latch and lifted the lid. Inside, everything was meticulously packed in layers of documents, folders, and notebooks. Jack's fingers trembled slightly as he reached in and lifted the first bundle. The paper was thick, yellowing, but clean. Each folder was labeled in neat block letters: maintenance logs, 1974, internal complaints, OSHA, employee injury reports. There were dozens of them. Jack pulled out a thick file labeled confidential, 06-1975 incident reports, and laid it open on the table. Inside were black and white photocopies, incident photos, diagrams, even typed witness statements. Many of them had red pencil markings, underlines, question marks, and short, frustrated notes scribbled in the margins. One stood out. Failure. Analysis doesn't match injury pattern. Check page 3. Emily leaned over his shoulder as he flipped through. "What's that mean?" "It means someone lied about what happened," Jack said. "They said a machine failed. But this report says the damage wasn't consistent with a malfunction. It was forced." He pulled another folder. This one contained memos between Charles McAllister and someone named Dan J. Crosby, a legal rep from the Pennsylvania Labor Board. One letter read, "Charles, I'm telling you, this guy Kincaid's got people everywhere. You file this complaint and your days at that mill are numbered. I've seen it before. Walk away. Live to fight another day." Charles had replied, "If I walk away, someone else gets crushed. Literally. I'd rather die than stay silent." Jack felt the words land like bricks in his chest. He knew, Jack said quietly. He knew what was coming. Emily didn't speak. She just watched her father, her eyes wide. Jack flipped through more pages, spreading them across the table like puzzle pieces. Diagrams, timelines, employee statements. Some were anonymous, others signed. One was from a man named Luis Trammell, who claimed he saw Kincaid arguing with Charles 2 days before his death. Said something about how accidents can happen when folks don't listen. "I told my shift leader. They told me to forget it or lose my job." Another statement was from a young woman, Nancy Bright, a secretary who said she overheard Kincaid call someone at Allegheny Iron Works the night before Charles died. He said it was being taken care of. Said the guy was too noisy. Jack sat back, running both hands over his face. "God," he muttered. This toolbox. It's a bomb. Emily, still looking at one of the letters, said, "You mean like a truth bomb?" "No," Jack said. "I mean it's gonna explode. If this gets out, people are gonna panic. Reputations, companies, even a family name. It's been buried for almost 50 years. Emily looked up. "That's why it has to come out right." Jack didn't answer immediately. He just stared at the papers, overwhelmed by how much someone had risked to put all this together. Lillian had done this. She'd gathered it, organized it, sealed it. And she'd waited quietly for someone to find it. Jack looked at Emily. "This isn't just about Charles McAllister anymore." Emily blinked. "It's not," he shook his head. "It's about the people who got hurt because of Kincaid. The men who lost their jobs. The ones who died working machines that weren't safe. All the cover-ups. All the silence." He stood and began repacking the files carefully. "We need help," he said. "We can't just drop this online and hope someone listens. We need someone who knows how to handle evidence. Someone who's not afraid to pull threads even if it gets ugly." Emily looked nervous now. "Like the news," Jack nodded. "Margot said she had a contact in journalism. If she's serious, now's the time." There was a knock on the doorframe. Both of them turned quickly. A man stood in the entrance of the mill, tall, thin, with silver hair and a long black coat. His hands were in his pockets, and his expression was unreadable. "Did I come at a bad time?" he asked. Ranger growled low. Jack stepped in front of Emily, tense. "Who are you?" The man raised both hands slowly. "Name's Gordon Brandt. I'm a journalist. Margot sent me." Jack didn't move. Brandt continued calm and confident. "She said if I wanted the story of a lifetime, I should come see you. Said it was big, buried, and about to make some very powerful people very nervous." Jack slowly exhaled. "She moved fast." "She doesn't waste time," Brandt said. "Neither do I." Jack studied him, then gestured to the table. "Take a look." Brandt walked over, eyes scanning the documents. He pulled on a pair of glasses and read in silence for a full 5 minutes. Then he looked up. "You're not exaggerating," he said. "This is massive. If even half of it checks out, it'll blow open a part of Pittsburgh's history nobody wants to touch." Jack crossed his arms. "You willing to touch it?" Brandt didn't blink. "I'll dig. Quietly at first. No promises, but I'll get answers." Jack nodded slowly. "Then we start tomorrow," Brandt said. "And once we do, there's no going back." Emily stood beside her dad, eyes locked on the files. Jack looked at her. She didn't look like a scared kid anymore. She looked like someone who understood what was at stake. "We're not going back," Jack said. "Because the truth doesn't knock. It breaks the lock." The newsroom was quieter than Jack expected. He'd always imagined these places buzzing with phones, clacking keys, the chaotic hum of breaking stories. But Brandt's office at the Allegheny Free Press was tucked into the far corner of the building, behind a frosted glass door with peeling letters. Inside, the only noise was the hum of an old space heater and the occasional rattle from the street outside. Brandt was already at his desk, sleeves rolled, glasses perched low on his nose as he scanned copies of the files Jack and Emily had brought in. "I don't need to sensationalize this," he muttered. "It's heavy as hell on its own." Jack leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Emily sat nearby with Ranger curled at her feet, her backpack open and a small notebook resting on her knee. She'd started sketching again while they waited, not pictures but lines, connections, names and dates, something she'd started doing when the story got too big for words. Brant flipped a page and looked up. You understand what happens if this gets published, right? Jack nodded. Yeah. I'm not just talking about headlines. I'm talking lawsuits. Pushback. People digging into you. He pointed at Jack. Your past. Your life. Everything. Jack didn't flinch. I don't have anything left to lose. Brant gave a short laugh. That's what everyone says until someone with money decides you're a problem. Then he turned to Emily. What about you, kid? Emily looked up serious. We're not doing this for fame or revenge. We're doing it because no one else did. Brant paused, then nodded slowly. All right. He picked up a manila folder. This OSHA report, it's gold. It directly contradicts the company's version of events. And these employee statements, especially the ones with names still legible. We might be able to track some of them down. See if they're willing to go on record. Jack pushed off the wall. You think any of them are still around? Brant shrugged. Some. Maybe not all. But one voice from the inside could tip this whole thing over. He stood grabbing his coat. You two are coming with me. We're going to talk to someone. Jack frowned. Who Luis Trammell? He's the guy who claimed he overheard Kincaid threatening Charles. According to my sources, he still lives out in Braddock, retired, keeps to himself. They left the office and piled into Brant's battered Subaru. The drive was quiet. Pittsburgh's industrial edges passed by like ghosts, graffiti-tagged warehouses, chain-link fences, buildings with boarded-up windows, and histories no one wanted to talk about. By the time they pulled into a narrow street in Braddock, the clouds had thickened, the kind of gray that made everything look like it was holding its breath. Luis Trammell lived in a one-story brick house with overgrown shrubs and a rusting mailbox. A faded Steelers flag hung limp from the porch. Brant approached first, knocking 3 times. After a long pause, the door creaked open. An old man stood in the doorway leaning on a cane. His frame was thin shoulders hunched, but his eyes were sharp. Yeah, he asked, guarded. Mr. Trammell, Brant said, offering a card. Gordon Brant, Free Press. We'd like to ask you about McAllister Steel. Luis's face hardened instantly. Not interested. Jack stepped forward. We're not here to sell you anything. We just need to talk. It's about Charles. Luis hesitated. His eyes flicked to Emily, then to the dog, then back to Jack. After a beat, he opened the door wider. 5 minutes. They stepped into a small living room. It smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and dust. Old photographs lined the mantel. Family portraits, war medals, a framed black and white of Luis as a young man in a steelworker's jumpsuit. You're digging up bones, Luis said, lowering himself into a worn recliner. We're trying to tell the truth, Brant replied. Luis gave a dry chuckle. Truth, that's rich. Jack pulled the OSHA report from his bag and handed it over. Luis didn't touch it, just looked at it. Do you remember filing a statement? Jack asked. About Kincaid, Luis's expression didn't change. I remember being told not to. Emily quietly, but you did. Finally, Luis reached for the folder. He flipped through the top pages with shaking fingers. They told me I was making trouble, he said. Said I was putting the whole plant at risk. My job, my pension, my family. Did Kincaid threaten Charles? Jack asked. Luis looked up, eyes glassy. I heard them argue. Real bad. Kincaid said something about Charles being too loud. Said accidents happen. I told my supervisor. Next day, Charles was gone. Emily's voice was quiet but firm. Why didn't you go public? Luis looked at her, and for the first time there was regret behind his eyes. Because I was scared. Brant leaned in. Would you say that on the record now? Luis hesitated. His hand trembled as he placed the folder on his lap. I don't know, he said honestly. I'm 83. I don't want my last years spent fighting lawsuits. Jack stepped forward. What if you didn't have to fight? What if you just told your story and let someone else carry the weight? Luis was silent for a long time. Then he reached over to the table beside his chair, pulled out a faded envelope, and handed it to Jack. I kept this, he said. Thought it was nothing. But maybe now it's not. Inside was a photo. Charles and Luis arm in arm at the factory gates, smiling, alive. On the back, June 28, 1975. Last good day. Luis wiped his face with one hand. Tell people what they did. But tell them what he stood for, too. He was the only boss who gave a damn about us. Jack nodded. We will. They left the house in silence. Back in the car, Brant said, That man just became your story's heart. Jack stared out the window as the houses passed by. No, he said. Charles did. We're just giving it back. Emily smiled. Then let's make it loud. Brant grinned. Oh, it's gonna be loud. And as they drove back toward the city, Jack knew the dominoes had begun to fall. Because someone had finally said the thing that had never been spoken. They knew it wasn't an accident. Brant dropped the final folder on his desk with a heavy sigh. We have enough. Hell, we have more than enough. Jack didn't sit. He stood by the window, arms folded, eyes locked on the skyline outside. The steel city stretched before them, gritty, worn, proud. It had swallowed secrets for decades, but now for the first time one of those secrets was ready to rise. Emily, curled up in the corner with Ranger at her feet, watched both men silently. She'd drawn a timeline across 4 notebook pages, now dates, names, events. Charles's death wasn't an accident, and it wasn't random. It had been built piece by piece, decision by decision, lie by lie. Brant sat back in his chair and tapped the manila folder. We've got the OSHA files, the incident photos, employee testimonies Luis is willing to go on record, the memo from Dan Crosby warning Charles about Kincaid. All of it. Jack turned. What's the next move? Brant raised an eyebrow. Next move, we publish. We light the fuse. Jack shook his head. Not yet. Brant frowned. Not yet, Jack. We've got a story that could topple legacies. You think we're the only ones sniffing around? Jack walked to the table and pulled out a fresh printout, a screenshot of an email forwarded to him by Margot. The message was short, anonymous, sent to her school address. Not all ghosts want to be found. Some should stay buried. Walk away. Brant read it, face darkening. You think it's legit? She got it an hour after you visited Luis, Jack said. Somebody's watching. Emily looked up. You think it's Kincaid's people? He may be dead, Jack said, but someone's still protecting the legacy. Brant leaned back, thinking. Well, we can't just sit on it. If we wait too long, someone will bury it again. Or worse, and I'm not saying we stall, Jack replied. I'm saying we plan it right. If we're going to blow this open, we need noise. We need more than one paper, more than one voice. Brant nodded slowly. Syndicate it, every outlet that'll touch it, Jack said. And we need an event, something public, a reason to bring people in. Emily perked up. What about the memorial? Jack turned to her. What memorial? She flipped through her notebook and pulled out a flyer she'd found online days ago. It was for a Founders' Day event, an annual celebration honoring Pittsburgh's industrial roots held at the Riverwalk Museum. One of the sponsors listed at the bottom, the Kincaid Foundation. Jack took the flyer, his hands clenched. Brant saw the shift in his face. Let me guess. They're going to stand up and tell the world how much Kincaid meant to this city. Jack's voice was ice. And maybe we'll be there to remind them what he really did. Brant grinned. Now that's a headline. Jack didn't smile. 2 days later, the plan was in motion. Margot had spoken with an old contact at WESX News. They were hungry for an exclusive. Brant had lined up columns at 2 national outlets. Luis's interview was already taped, edited, clean, powerful. All that was left was timing. The Founders' Day event was 3 days out. Jack, Emily, and Brant met in the mill again to finalize the release. The files were copied and stored on encrypted drives. Hard backups were hidden in 2 separate locations. Ranger seemed to sense the tension. He paced more than usual, never fully relaxed. That night, Jack stood on the roof of the mill, looking out at the city. Emily joined him, arms wrapped in a blanket. You think it'll matter? She asked. Jack didn't answer right away. The wind tugged at his jacket. Below, the city glowed in soft orange and steel blue. He finally said, I think it already does. Emily leaned into his side. You're not who you were when we got here. Jack looked at her. Neither are you. She smiled faintly. You think Charles knew anyone would do this? Pick up the pieces. Jack thought of the letter. The hidden box. The quiet desperation behind Lillian's words. I think he hoped, he said. And I think hope's a kind of plan. Morning came fast. They were at the Riverwalk Museum before the crowds. Brant moved through the press like he belonged there, credentials flashing. Jack wore a borrowed blazer over his usual worn t-shirt. Emily had braided her hair neat and tight. The courtyard filled by noon business leaders, city officials, journalists, locals. At the center was a stage draped in banners that read, Pittsburgh's legacy built by hands of steel. Jack watched from the edge. He spotted the Kincaid Foundation reps, polished, smiling, shaking hands. Then a surprise. On the edge of the crowd, a woman in her 60s, dark gray coat, sharp eyes. Emily saw her, too. Is that? Jack nodded. Nancy Bright. From the files. She approached quietly. No fanfare. No announcement. Just walked up beside them and said, I heard. From Luis. I want you to know he wasn't the only one who stayed silent. Jack turned. You worked with Charles. She nodded. He was a good man, and they buried him. You do what you came here to do. Then she disappeared into the crowd. Jack took a deep breath. At exactly 12:15, Brant stepped onto the stage and took the mic as if scheduled. The crowd hushed. He cleared his throat. Before the next speaker, I've been asked to read a short dedication, one recently uncovered and long overdue. He paused, looking straight into the sea of faces. Jack could feel the city holding its breath. Then Brant read, Charles McAllister died July 2nd, 1975. The records say it was an accident. But new evidence shows it was more than that. It was a cover-up. Today we bring the truth forward. The crowd rippled. Confused murmurs. phones raised, cameras turned. Brandt stepped aside, and on the massive screen behind the stage, Luis Tramel's video played. His voice steady, I stayed quiet. But I saw what happened. I heard the threats, and I know what they did to Charles. He didn't die because of a machine. He died because he said no. When the screen went black, the courtyard was dead silent, until one man in the back clapped, then another, then more. Not a roar, but enough. Jack turned to Emily. Her eyes were shining. "It's out now," she whispered. "They can't bury it again." Jack nodded, his throat tight. "We just made sure the silence ends here." The press didn't wait long. By the next morning, Jack's phone buzzed nonstop. Headlines flooded the local news feeds, then spilled into national coverage. Steel Giant's legacy under fire. McAllister death ruled highly suspicious after new evidence emerges, and Brandt's front-page feature in the Allegheny Free Press, Buried Truths, the Fall of Walter Kincaid. They watched the fallout from a diner booth near the edge of town, Jack, Emily, Brandt, and Margot. Plates of untouched pancakes sat between them, growing cold. Ranger lay at their feet, tail occasionally twitching in sleep. Margot was the first to break the silence. "They're trying to discredit Luis." Jack didn't flinch. "Of course they are." Brandt pulled out his tablet and showed them an article from the Pittsburgh Ledger. Sources inside the Kincaid Foundation claim Luis Tramel has a history of unstable behavior. They're calling the documents inconclusive. Emily frowned. "But we have more." "Right. We have enough," Brandt said. "But they're not arguing facts. They're arguing perception. That's how power fights back." Jack pushed his plate aside. "Then we push harder." Brandt raised an eyebrow. How Jack glanced at Margot. "By giving them something they can't spin." Margot nodded slowly, catching on. "The will." Brandt blinked. "The what?" Margot reached into her coat and pulled out a sealed envelope yellowed with age. She placed it gently on the table. "My mother kept it locked in a safety deposit box. I only got access after she passed last year. I didn't even know it existed until then." Jack leaned forward. "Is it real handwritten? Notarized? Dated 2 weeks before he died?" Her voice dropped. "He left everything to Aunt Lillian. Not to my mother. Not to the company. He knew she'd protect it." Brandt slowly took the envelope and opened it. Inside was a single page, elegant cursive on thick paper. "To my sister, if you're reading this, then I've likely paid the price for saying no. You always told me my stubbornness would kill me. Maybe you were right. But if the world ever cares to know what really happened, show them. Don't let my name be rewritten by cowards." Charles Brandt set the letter down. His hands trembled slightly. This is emotional dynamite," he said. "You release this alongside the evidence and suddenly it's not just about corruption. It's about betrayal. It's a man's dying wish." Margot's voice was quiet. "It's about justice." Jack looked at Brandt. "Then release it." Brandt nodded. "Tonight." That evening, a second wave of coverage hit. Brandt's follow-up story dropped at 6 p.m. sharp. News stations across the state picked it up. National outlets followed. Twitter exploded. Justice for Charles trended within the hour. Suddenly, the Kincaid Foundation wasn't just fending off questions, it was bleeding credibility. Donors pulled out. Board members resigned. and a previously shelved investigation by the Pennsylvania Bureau of Labor reopened overnight. Jack watched it all unfold from the edge of the warehouse floor. The mill felt different now, less haunted, less heavy. Emily sat on a stack of crates nearby, phone in hand. "Dad." He turned. "There's something you should see." She held out the phone. A video. Jack took it, hit play. It was grainy, clearly taken in secret, but the voices were clear. "You told me it was handled." It was handled. Until some homeless vet and a kid started poking around. Then unhandle it. Before they ruin everything. Jack froze. "Who sent this?" Emily's voice was tight. "Brant. He got it through an anonymous tip." Jack stared at the screen. "That voice. It's from the current CEO of Kincaid Holdings," she said. "Evan Kincaid, Walter's grandson." Jack's chest tightened. The past wasn't just reaching out, it had grown roots. Generational ones. Brant's voice crackled through Jack's phone. "You just heard it, yeah. That clip's real. My guy verified the audio. It came from an insider, someone who's had enough." Jack clenched his jaw. "That's not just an echo, that's a pattern." Brant agreed. "Which means this isn't just history. It's happening now." The next morning, legal threats arrived. A manila envelope was slid under Brant's office door. Cease and desist. Claims of defamation. Warnings of continued reputational damage. A second arrived at Margot's home. Jack wasn't surprised. He was angry, but not surprised. "Means we're getting close," he told Emily, as they packed up from the mill. "What now?" she asked. "We hit back, but smart. We don't escalate, we expose." She tilted her head. "How?" He smiled faintly. "We do what Charles did. We leave a trail." He picked up his backpack. Inside were the originals, every report, every letter, every photo. He'd spent the last week scanning them all, to encrypted drives, spreading them across cloud servers and hidden USBs. If someone tried to erase this, they'd have to burn down half the internet. And then there was the toolbox, still in the corner, still holding one final folder. Jack walked over and opened it. Inside a personal notebook. Charles's. Full of sketches, notes, names, observations, and at the very back 3 pages of names underlined in red. Emily peered over his shoulder. "What is that?" Jack ran a finger down the list. People who knew, she frowned. "You think they're still alive? Maybe some." He looked at her. "But if they are, they're next." Emily's expression hardened. "Then we talk to them first." Jack nodded. "Before someone else does." That night, a new article dropped an editorial from Brant. This is no longer a story about a steelworker who died 50 years ago. This is a story about what we inherit when we silence truth. It's about a city that forgot its ghosts, and the people brave enough to speak for them. The final line read, "We thought the fire died with the mill, but some embers never go out." Jack read it 3 times. Then he looked at Emily and said, "It's time to finish this." Because the storm wasn't coming. It had already arrived. The parking lot was nearly empty when they arrived. Rain fell in a slow, steady drizzle, soaking the cracked pavement outside the nursing home. The building loomed in front of them, 3 stories of red brick and pale window blinds, lifeless and still. A sign near the entrance read, "Laurel Oaks Senior Living." Its letters faded and chipped. Jack adjusted the collar of his jacket, glanced over at Emily, and said, "Ready." Emily knotted her ponytail, already damp from the rain. Let's find him before someone else does. They stepped inside. The air was warm and thick with the scent of antiseptic and old flowers. A tired-looking receptionist gave them a polite nod, barely glancing up from her crossword puzzle. "We're here to see Donald Rivers," Jack said. She glanced at a clipboard. "Room 213. Elevators to your right." They found him sitting by the window, wrapped in a navy cardigan, a folded newspaper in his lap. His hair was white and thin, but his posture was sharp, like he hadn't fully surrendered to age. He didn't look surprised when they entered. He just looked tired. "You're the ones asking about Charles," he said before Jack even spoke. Jack nodded. "You knew him." Donald didn't smile. "We all knew him. Some of us just chose to forget." Emily took a step forward. "We found his records, his notes, and your name was in them." Donald sighed and gestured to the chairs. "Then I suppose you've earned the truth." They sat. He looked out the rain-streaked window for a long time before he began. "I worked at Allegheny Iron Works back then. Safety inspector. My job was to clear machines for operation after maintenance. I signed off on the press that killed Charles." Emily swallowed hard. Jack leaned in. "Was it faulty?" Donald shook his head. "No, that's the thing. It had passed all checks. Everything was normal. But the day before Charles's shift, someone tampered with the override system. I reported it. The report disappeared." "You filed it?" Jack asked. Donald gave a hollow laugh. "I thought I did." The next day I was pulled into a private meeting. Walter Kincaid himself. He told me I'd seen wrong, that I must have made a mistake. "And you believed him?" Emily asked. "No," he said quietly. "But I had a wife, a newborn." Kincaid didn't threaten me directly. He didn't have to. I knew what happened to people who stood in his way. Jack said Charles stood anyway. Donald nodded. "And they made sure he paid." He reached into a drawer beside his bed and pulled out a weathered cassette tape. "What's that?" Jack asked. "My confession. I recorded it 5 years ago. For no one in particular. Just in case someone came looking." Jack took it carefully. "It's not much," Donald said. "But it's the truth." They sat in silence for a moment. Rain tapped the glass like fingers on a coffin lid. "I should have said something sooner," Donald muttered. Emily leaned forward. "You're saying it now. That matters." He looked at her, and something in his face softened. "Maybe it does." Jack stood. "We'll make sure this gets heard." As they turned to leave, Donald spoke again. "Be careful. The people who carry a legacy like Kincaid's, they don't give it up easy." Jack met his gaze. "Neither do we." Later that night, Brant transferred the cassette audio to digital. Donald's voice crackled with age, but it was steady. "I saw the report. I saw what they erased. Charles McAllister didn't die in an accident. He died in a cover-up, and I was part of it. I didn't kill him, but I didn't save him either." Jack listened to it 3 times. Emily didn't say a word. She just stared at the screen, eyes glassy. "Is this enough?" she finally asked. Brant nodded. "Enough to bury them." He stood. "We release it tomorrow. I'll package the audio with the confession transcript, the photos, the inspection logs. It'll hit every outlet I've got." Jack didn't move. Emily looked at him. "What's wrong?" He shook his head. "It's not wrong. It's just After all this, I'm starting to wonder what comes after the truth. Brant didn't miss a beat. You deal with what it breaks and what it builds. Margot called that night. They're panicking, she said. Evan Kincaid's legal team just put out a statement calling everything fabricated hearsay, Jack replied. Of course they did. He's going on record tomorrow, a live interview. Brant raised an eyebrow. He's stepping into the light, Margot confirmed it. Channel 5, 8 p.m. He's going to try to salvage the legacy. Spin it. Jack exhaled slowly. Then we'll beat him to it. He turned to Brant. We go live first. Drop the recording, the files, the interviews, everything, before Evan gets a single word out. Brant grinned. Now that's how you corner a ghost. The next morning was chaos. Jack's phone buzzed nonstop. The audio had gone viral within the hour. Hashtags exploded. News anchors replayed Donald's voice over and over. I didn't kill him, but I didn't save him either. It echoed through the city. Protests formed outside Kincaid Holdings. Alumni of the company's former subsidiaries demanded internal investigations. The state launched a formal inquiry. And yet, as Jack watched the coverage from his kitchen, he knew it wasn't over. Emily joined him holding 2 mugs of coffee. She handed one over. We did it. He nodded. Almost. She gave him a look. You're thinking about tomorrow. Evan's still going on air, he said. He's going to lie. Twist it. Maybe even make people doubt again. Emily's voice was calm. Let him talk. We already shouted. Jack stared out the window. The sky was clearing. Yeah, he said. But this time we make sure no one forgets. Because the past doesn't just haunt. Sometimes it fights back. The studio lights were colder than Jack expected. He sat across from Evan Kincaid, separated by a sleek glass table and decades of buried history. Cameras circled slowly around them. The Channel 5 anchor, a poised woman named Celeste Gray, welcomed the audience back from commercial. This segment, she said, will conclude our special coverage on the recent revelations surrounding McAllister Steel, the Kincaid Foundation, and the legacy left behind by Walter Kincaid. Jack didn't flinch. He'd had 3 sleepless nights to prepare for this. Evan Kincaid sat tall, clean-cut in a tailored suit, looking more like a politician than the CEO of a legacy empire. He smiled with practiced calm as Celeste turned to him. Mr. Kincaid, your family has long been associated with Pittsburgh's industrial success, but this week's reports have cast a very different light. What do you have to say to the public? Evan leaned forward slightly, folding his hands together. First, I want to express my sympathies to anyone who has been affected by these accusations. My grandfather helped build this city. He created jobs, supported families, and stood for progress. It's easy to reinterpret the past through a modern lens, but I urge the public not to confuse rumor with fact. Jack didn't blink. He let the silence hang, then said, Charles McAllister wasn't a rumor. Evan turned toward him, the smile barely fading. And I'm sorry for what happened to him. I truly am. But let's be honest, this is 50-year-old speculation. People misremember. Stories change. Without verified legal action, we're just telling ghost stories. Jack slid a small recorder onto the table. Ghosts don't speak, he said. But Donald Rivers did. Celeste looked between them. For our viewers, Donald Rivers, a former inspector for Allegheny Iron Works, provided a recorded confession stating that your grandfather knowingly ignored safety violations and contributed to the death of Charles McAllister. Evan stayed quiet for half a second too long. Then, an elderly man's memory, conveniently released after his health declined. My legal team is already investigating the tape's authenticity. Jack leaned in. Then investigate the OSHA reports, the missing inspection logs, the handwritten will, the memos between Walter and Dan Crosby. Every piece points to a truth your family spent decades trying to erase. Evan's voice dropped half a tone. You're attacking the memory of a man who can't defend himself. Jack's voice was steady. So was I. Until I found out the truth. He turned to Celeste. I was homeless when this started. My daughter and I were digging through junk just to survive. We didn't set out to destroy anyone. But when you find a body buried under concrete, you don't walk away because the killer's famous. The room went still. I'm not here for revenge, Jack continued. I'm here because Charles McAllister gave his life trying to protect people who couldn't protect themselves, and no legacy is worth more than that. Evan Kincaid looked straight at the camera, jaw tight. My family has done more good for this city than your grief ever will. Jack didn't respond. Because that's when Celeste turned her earpiece, crackling. She raised a hand. This just in, she said. The Pennsylvania Bureau of Labor has officially reopened its investigation into McAllister Steel and is issuing subpoenas for archived documents previously sealed by court order. We've also confirmed that a second whistleblower has come forward from within Kincaid Holdings, corroborating claims of a legacy of internal suppression of safety violations. Evan's face fell just slightly, just enough for the world to see. Jack sat back, quiet, resolute. They'd already won. Outside the studio, Emily waited. She stood on the sidewalk with Ranger at her side, and a small crowd gathered across the street holding signs that read, "Justice for Charles and Truth Doesn't Rust." Jack stepped out into the cool night air. Emily met his eyes. You were great, she said softly. He shook his head. I was terrified. But you told the truth, she said. And people listened. Brant joined them a moment later, pulling off his press badge. The tape's already clipped and streaming online. 5 million views and counting. Jack looked at him. Will it change anything? Brant shrugged. It already is. Down the block, another group gathered. Not protesters. Reporters. People asking questions. About Charles. About the other names in the file. About the broken systems that had let this go unpunished for so long. Emily looked around. It's like they finally see it. Jack nodded. You can't look away from the truth once it's in the light. Margot pulled up a few minutes later in her pickup, a grin spreading across her face as she climbed out. They're calling it the biggest corporate reckoning in Pennsylvania labor history, she said. You two just cracked it wide open. Jack smiled. We didn't start this. Emily looked up at him. But we finished it. They stood in silence for a long moment, breathing in the night air. And then, as the crowd thinned and cameras moved on, Jack opened his backpack and pulled out the toolbox. Still dented, still scratched, still holding the weight of truth. He set it gently on the curb. What are you doing? Emily asked. He smiled at her. Letting go. Inside was one final note written not by Charles, but by Jack himself. To whoever finds this next truth doesn't stay buried forever. And the ones who protect it don't always wear badges or suits. Sometimes they're just people with nothing left to lose, but a whole lot of reasons to try. He shut the lid and stood. Margot took Emily's hand. Brant lit a cigarette. Ranger wagged his tail, sensing the shift. Jack looked up at the night sky. The clouds were clearing, and for the first time in a long time, the weight in his chest was gone. Because this wasn't a story about a man who died. It was a story about what lived on, about the people who refused to forget, about the cost of silence and the power of breaking it. It was a story about legacy. But more than that, it was a story about truth, and now the world finally knew it.